And hi, my name is Clayton Patterson. We're here at the Clayton Gallery Outlaw Art Museum, and I'm over here with David Goldstein, a long-term friend and an expert on drugs, people, the underground, and the ephemera that goes with the drug culture. And he has a lot of ephemera that goes with that. So David, tell us.
Well, I've been a collector of drug books and literature for many years, let's say 40, and it's been my privilege to meet some really fascinating and outrageous people who contributed major information on the subject of drugs in New York.
So within this archive you have, which is major and actually very well manicured and taken care of,
Yes.
you have a lot of ephemera that goes along with the drug culture. Now, in drug culture in particular, we're talking about things that are basically psychedelics and related to pot.
Well, yes, we'll talk about me and the drug literature, and I would like to talk about the people who lived in New York City specifically, and my knowledge of them merely by being friends with them.
Okay, very good.
My collection right now, I'd like to just talk about it. It's about 1,000 items of books, magazines, signed blotter art, which is really amazing to me that I have it. This is LSD blotter art. Images that were put on perf paper that were, in the past, made hot by dripping LSD onto it. But now it's all cold, and it's just signed by a whole selection of really famous people on the subject. Tom Lytle actually started it with Mark McCloud at San Francisco, and I was friends with Tom, and actually Tom lived in my house for about a year. He and I did a whole series of papers on the subject. Every now and then I contribute something, and the first paper I did was on a victim of the CIA LSD MK Ultra program, and the next one I did was with Tom and on the first paper on the house music phenomenon. And another paper I did with him was on the toad smoking myth that happened in the late 90s here in New York City and around America. He was a very interesting fellow, a very complex and complicated person. I'm glad I knew him. When he died prematurely, his collection was sold. He started out in the 80s as a co-editor for Psychozoic Press, and he went on to do psychedelic monographs and essays, which became very famous. Since I was in the background on a lot of these things, I helped in the publication of several books that Jim Fleming produced from Otana Media in Brooklyn. That's been my role, just helping other people to produce their books. I'd like to talk about one of the most important people on the subject of drugs, and that was John Beresford. He's a British doctor, and he lived on Allen Street and Rivington, on the west side of Allen Street.
What year would this be?
This was he lived there between 1960 and 1965, but he worked as a doctor in a child's hospital on Upper Fifth Avenue. But he had a secret life in the sense that in 1963 and 1964, John purchased LSD, psilocybin, ibogaine, and a whole slew of other psychochemicals from L. Light and Company, and then eventually through Sandoz Pharmaceutical. He was very good friends with Albert Hofmann, and the people who stayed with John on Allen Street between 1963 and 64 went on to produce some of the most famous and popular books on psychedelics. One of them was Peter Stafford, who wound up producing the Psychedelics Encyclopedia. The first edition that I had was signed by him and John Beresford and Bruce Eisner and Albert Hofmann and Anita Hoffman, his wife, which is a very unusual thing. But the Psychedelics Encyclopedia went through 2 reprintings, and in the 90s, a small press in Berkeley did an expurgated version of it. But Peter also did 17 Questions About Psychedelics, his proposed college course. And he's also famous for producing magigrams, and that's a direct result of John's activity. When John purchased these grams of acid, he didn't keep it for himself. He put it in a jar of mayonnaise jar, and it was sugar in it, and he dissolved the acid in a little bit of water, and he dissolved it in the sugar. And that became the means of distribution. John also gave LSD to Myron Stolleroff in California, and through another unfortunate incident, there's a fellow by the name of Michael Hollingshead, who just moved in with John from England. He took one of these jars of sugared LSD, and he brought it to Millbrook. So John Beresford was responsible for all of the psychedelic research in the 3 centers in the United States, in Palo Alto with Myron Stolaroff, and through Michael Hollingshead and Leary in Millbrook, and here in New York City. John himself gave psychochemicals, including mescaline and LSD, to something like 40 professionals. John was more interested in the professional experiences and recording it rather than the general population. He thought that people should be trained in how to use LSD and other drugs. His favorite drug, though, was mescaline. He repeatedly mentioned that to me. I was very good friends with him. After he died, I purchased his library from his estate. I mentioned Michael Hollingshead. Michael Hollingshead took one of the, like I said, a mayonnaise jar full of LSD-infused sugar, 10,000 hits at 200 microgram hits in one jar. And so if you took LSD in Millbrook in the 60s, before it was made illegal, it was probably John's acid through Michael. He wrote a book called The Man Who Turned On the World. He was responsible for turning on lots of people. And the book is available online. You could look for it. Besides Peter Stafford, there was a guy named Bruce Eisner who was also involved, who lived with John here on Allen Street. And Bruce went on to produce a series of books on MDMA, which is quite unusual because most people knew about it from 1985 on, but it was actually discovered in 1978. And these days, all these chemicals are, again, being popularized because of the research done at Johns Hopkins University and here in NYU. Primarily using these, either psilocybin or LSD, for lessening anxiety for people who are dying. And there's other mechanisms or proposed mechanisms or purposes for the use of LSD and psilocybin, including increasing intelligence and self-knowledge. John had a very interesting experience. His day job, like I said, was being in those days, was being a pediatrician for children. But he was a pro bono on call 24/7 as a doctor in Harlem. And one of his trips, he went with another doctor to treat someone, and there was another person present in the apartment that he went to, and that fellow pulled out a knife and slashed John on his right side of his face. He had a 2-inch scar as a result of it, but he maintained his public service to help people. He went back to school for a year of study in psychiatry, so he became a psychiatrist. And this is when he was living in Canada. After New York, he moved back to Canada, essentially. And John was a very mild fellow, and he almost had no ego, which is very unusual among drug people. And he was a happy fellow for the most part, and he spent most of his money and most of his time contributing any money he got to LSD prisoners. Right, the Committee on Unjust Sentencing was his creation, and I stayed at his house up in Canada several times, and he was disappeared in the morning because he was upstairs writing letters and checks to prisoners. So according to his widow, most of his money disappeared in small checks. He mailed $35 to $50 checks to hundreds of LSD prisoners throughout the United States.
And then there was Hoffman was from Canada, Saskatoon?
No,
or Switzerland.
You're talking about Albert Hoffman lived in Switzerland. Yes, spoke German, Swiss German. And there's an interesting anecdote with Hoffman. Again, with the blotter art, people asked him to sign blotter art because Albert Hoffman's signature on a piece of blotter art would be, valuable and pretty famous. So he refused, and the reason he refused is because someone came to him with a signed blotter art and said, "Look, and it was hot. It was LSD on the art, and the DEA here in the United States busted the person." So they eventually interviewed him to see, do you have any connection with this? And he said, "No, So he was afraid that with his signature on it, people would be selling it on the underground with his signature on it. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. Again, John Beresford's primary goal was to distribute it to researchers throughout the world. John knew all the major players at the time period. I'd like to now talk about David Solomon. David Solomon is responsible for the 4 most influential books on drugs in the 60s and the 70s. Let's see, the first book he did was LSD, the Consciousness Expanding Drug, where he met Leary. Now, David told me that Leary was a square, looked like this, you know, and he wore a tweed suit jacket with leather elbow patches. And he didn't smoke pot and he didn't trust potheads until he met David Solomon, who was working for Metro, for, what was it called? I forgot the name of the jazz magazine that he was working for. And everybody at the jazz magazine smoked pot. And so Leary chilled out about that. The other 3 books, the LSD, the Consciousness Expanding Drug, Marijuana Papers, which was very, very popular, and Drugs and Sexuality, which was just a combination of things that he did with George Andrews, and Coca Leaf and Cocaine Papers. So he covered the major interests between 1965 and 1973 of what the American culture, what people wanted to know at the time period. The money that he made from his 4 books, he moved to England, Cambridge, with his family, wife and 2 daughters. And in Cambridge, he met a woman whose husband happened to be Francis Crick, famous DNA co-discoverer of the double helix of the DNA. But Crick was from the aristocracy, and yet he was a person of this. He liked it. He was a mensch. He was a person of the streets. His wife threw all kinds of parties in England for hippies, for any drug person or people in that circle. And at one of the parties, David met a guy named Ronald Shitsky. His name was Ron Stark. He was born Ronald Shitsky. He was an Orthodox Jew from Brooklyn. And he was also a paid informant for the CIA. But he was brilliant, spoke many languages, had drug businesses in dozens of countries around the world. But as far as David Solomon goes, he wound up sleeping on David Solomon's carpet. And he taught a guy named Richard Kemp how to manufacture an easy method of manufacturing LSD. And the LSD that the Cambridge crew produced was the best LSD, and eventually it came here in 1977. They had access to pharmaceutical pill-making machines, so they produced things like yellow microdots and red microdots, purple barrels, blue double domes, and these were excellent, very, very good. The problem is that part of the crew from Cambridge moved to Wales, and they wanted to produce LSD in 1,000 microgram levels, right, to really give people a feel about what the experience was. But it was their undoing, because they were eventually busted. The bust was known as the Operation Julie LSD bust, the largest bust in English history, essentially. David Solomon, being an old man and being a legalizer of cannabis, he spent 5.5 years at a British jail.
Really?
And he came back in 1983. I met him in 1984. And he spent the rest of his life here in New York City. David Solomon went to college here. He lived in various places in New York. The last time he lived was on West 10th Street, near the 7th Avenue Jazz Clubs. He was very big on jazz. And again, his contributions were the 4 books that he did. But he became incredibly cynical. He was the most cynical person that I had known. A very serious fellow. I considered myself in his presence comic relief, just to make him feel a little bit better about things. And he signed all of my copies of his books. And he thought that again, the main reason I think that all these famous people permitted me to be in their presence and talk to them was that I knew as much as or more than they did on this subject, because of my collection. And so that's why I became friends with John Beresford, David Solomon, and I mentioned Tom Lytle. All right, Harry Hermone and Todd Nicoria is next on the list here. Harry Hermone was an MD living in Brooklyn. He was a psychiatrist, and he had a private practice but also a clinic. In the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s, there were free clinics in Brooklyn and in California and in other places where if you needed medical care, you just went. You didn't need any prescription or any appointments or anything like that. Harry was a short barrel of a man with a big beard. And he spoke 7 or 8 languages. He could curse in 9 languages. And some of the books that I got in my collection came from Harry's thing. Harry was euphemistically known as a script doctor because anybody who wanted a drug, he would write a script for. He was very non-critical and non-opinionated about it. If someone came to him and said they wanted a drug, he would write a script for it. In 1980, the big drug epidemic was in Valium. And when Ronald Reagan was elected, his Attorney General became Ed Meese. And Ed Meese, the first 2 months of Ed Meese's campaign was to bust about 40 doctors around the United States, usually people working at free clinics and the hippie doctors who were freely prescribing Valium. First bust. So Harry wound up spending 2 years in Danbury, Connecticut. And when he came out, he wound up working for Kings County Medical as their chief psychiatrist. But before this, in his 70s, Harry was on the masthead of High Times magazine, the first 2 issues, as the medical director. In the middle 80s, he was the medical director of Plato's Retreat, which was the first public sex club here in New York City. Again, because of Harry's opinion that sex heals everything.
And that was his real name, Hermone?
His name was Harry Hermone, and people, because of his attitudes, they called him Harry Hormone.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. But Harry has a backstory, and the reason his backstory is very interesting. During World War II, his mother was a doctor, and they had to decide whether to be captured by the Nazis or the Russians. So they decided to be captured by the Russians. And so she did all the autopsies for the military in Siberia. So Harry lived above in that one room where she did all the autopsies, and he was a teenager at the time. And he slept over on a big rock above the mantle in Russia, in Siberia. So Harry has seen a lot of blood and guts and war, and he just wanted people around him to feel better, and if you wanted a drug, he would write you a script for it. He didn't care. But again, his script writing days were over when they busted him. And he became much more professional at working for Kings County in politics. He wound up in 1969. The government agency responsible for the controlling, quote unquote, of cannabis was the National Institute of Mental Health. The BNDD had no control over cannabis. And the National Institute of Mental Health hired Harry by that time he had moved to Austin, Texas. And Harry was growing pot for the National Institute of Mental Health. And his proposal was that cannabis producing a lot of, people talk a lot of cannabis, that it would be a perfect drug for psychiatric talk therapy. Because it's safe, it's been around 15,000 years, no one ever got hurt from it, and it would be great for people who don't like it, specifically for people who don't like cannabis. And you and I have met them. And he said that in a psychiatric environment, talk therapy environment, it would be the perfect drug. And so that's what he proposed. He never got a chance to put through his opinions. But in 1969, the person who was working as his medical assistant in Austin, Texas, was Todd Nicoria. And Todd actually got work at the National Institute of Mental Health. And somebody snitched on Todd because Todd smoked a joint in the stairwell and he was fired. Anyway, he became the leading medical marijuana, medical cannabis supporter in California. And through the years, he was the expert on the subject. And as a result, he was targeted by the police repeatedly. He always testified in court for the benefits of cannabis. And of course, when Prop 215 showed up in California, he was a big proponent of it. And being a medical cards on anybody who wanted it for medical reasons, Todd Nicoria signed off on it. But again, Harry's Hermone was a pretty radical fellow as far as sex goes. And he asked Todd Nicoria to have sex with his nurse in Austin, Texas. So no woman was safe from Harry Hermone.
I think this really preserves the, that was the purpose of this, was not to make the greatest video in the world.
No, I just wanted to talk about the people that were friends and their influence
stabilize the history somehow, and a record of you and whatever. And
it's a record of me knowing these people and having a library.
And, you know, you've been more sort of open about it than you ever have before.
Thank you for this interview. I got a chance to talk about
No, I'm very happy.
my friends that I knew, and New York City specifically. All these people that I mentioned were from New York.
How much time do we have left?
We've got like 2 minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes is what I mean.
So it's perfect.
Yeah,
So-
thank you.